Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 6 books. I was facilitating that by having a day on Friday without any internet whatsoever. It was down in our area, and I took the advantage of reading a book from beginning to end, which I almost never do, a whole book in a day. When I say book, I don't mean a 90-page book, I mean a 278-page book. I can't remember the last time I did that. But anyway, this is what I've read. Jimi Hendrix, Live in Lviv by Andry, Kurkov, Ukrainian author. Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, English author of part Yugoslav descent. Vietnamese author now living in Canada, Kim Thuy, M, and this is translated by Sheena Fishman. I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel, British writer, and this and Black Butterflies were both on the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction. This advanced to the shortlist, this didn't. I can't remember exactly how many were originally on the long list. I've read 6 of them. 3 of them have carried forward to the long list, to the shortlist, sorry. Vonnegut, Breakfast of Champions. And finally some poetry, Bandit Country by Northern Irish writer Conor Patterson. So I'm going to start with the Kurkov, which in my last video I said I probably couldn't talk that much because I've been commissioned to write a review for a magazine. That commission has been revoked because this book was actually written and originally published in 2012 before any usurpation of Ukrainian territory by Russia, which is kind of what the magazine I was going to write for was commissioned. So I was slightly flummoxed by that. So this has taken 11 years to reach translation into English. So I can talk about it freely. And it's a perfectly charming book. I mean, if you've read Kurkov before, it's a mixture of gentle, warm humour and a hint of melancholia. Lviv is a very western city in Ukraine, right on the Polish border. And this is a cast of characters just trying to get through. This is post-Soviet, independent Ukraine. But it's still tough making a living. And the scene starts off in a cemetery where a group of hippies have gathered to mark the anniversary of the death of Jimi Hendrix, the great guitarist of the 60s who died at age 28, 29 of a drugs overdose. And, or was he bumped off by the American Secret Service? Anyway, and you think, well, why is they in a cemetery in Lviv paying homage? Well, the conceit at the start of the book is that one of Hendrix's masterful guitar playing hands was cut off and smuggled through Latvia over to these guys in Lviv. So they're a bit like a sort of a saint's relic that Hendrix's guitar playing fingers are buried, and these hippies are paying homage. And until the very end, that's it for Jimi Hendrix. This is not, Jimi Hendrix is a bit of a red herring for this. As I say, it's really about this cast of characters just trying to get by. So one of the hippies is approached by an ex-KGB and then Ukrainian Secret Service guy, the Secret Intelligence guy, who has retired but has noticed that there's something very odd going on in Lviv, which I'll come to. And they sort of form a sort of relationship of the spider part, or the former spider part, and the former spy person doing the spying, which is kind of weird, but in a good way. There's another character who drives his car at night over the cobbles in Lviv, having sort of taken money to transport men, mainly from Poland, but from anywhere, who's heard of his services, in order to pass their awkward kidney stones that give them so much jip, which again is quite a nice, gentle, funny idea that driving at speed over Lviv's cobbles will dislodge these kidney stones. And these are the type of characters. There's an actress, there's an obsession with keeping fish in a fish tank or an aquarium and keeping them healthy. But what's happening in Lviv, which is the sort of the mystery that the characters are sort of indirectly and directly trying to solve, is that there's a strange plague of seagulls when Lviv is completely landlocked. It has no port. Odessa is the nearest port. There are also starfish appear, and there's a sort of terrible briny smell. So something's up, and in a way it reminded me of the old Jewish story of the Golem of Prague, only here the golem type figure is not to protect Lviv, it's actually causing all these strange things which are unnerving Lviv. And that's basically the story. You're just following the lives of these people, as I say, trying to scratch out a life, trying to scratch out a living, so they are free. They're not under the Soviet yoke, but their sort of economic circumstances don't seem to change very much for them. So, it was perfectly pleasant, easy read. It's, 360 pages, whatever it is, but you can race through it. I gave it 4 stars. And on to M by Kim Thuy, who was a Vietnamese boat person who escaped and as a child, who relocated to Canada. And this is a book about the Vietnam War from the point of view of the Vietnamese, but not really the Vietnamese combatants, not the people involved in the war, the innocent sort of civilians and bystanders. And it goes through the history of it in a very, very clever way, because it's a short book, 148 pages, you race through it. And the Vietnam War started originally with France, and like any colonial war, it was over a mineral right. In this case, it was rubber. Not oil, and not coltan as you currently have in the Congo, which is necessary for your mobile phones, so remember that next time you buy the latest iPhone. So it starts with the French plantation owner who is having an affair with one of his Vietnamese maidservants. So around the 1960s, when the colonial war with France starts. And we know the war ended in 1973, so you're talking a span of 13 years, not even a whole generation, which is normally taken at 20 years. But what's amazing about this book is you speed through several generations in the course of those 13 years, because people's lives are claimed by the war, including the French plantation owner, including the maid. So what's happening is a sort of very accelerated sort of babies being born, and then sort of their parents are dying or abandon them, and these babies, sort of grow up on the streets. It's very good about Saigon's street life. And they in turn have babies or have new families formed around them. So you get this sort of generational, sprint really, and it's very effective to sort of take you through just how destructive that war was. And you end up with 2 characters. One is born from an American GI having sex with a sex worker in Saigon, and there were many such babies, and a lot of them were evacuated to the States in this story, Canada, and these are desperate babies born out of desperation. The GI who's on his leave, which may be his final leave before he dies in a war that's all consuming, the women who have been driven into the city because they've escaped atrocities in the countryside, so they become sex workers, so they have a certain desperation. And I just think it's really cleverly done. It's very, as I say, very speedy. The chapters are sort of 2 pages long or so. They're mainly headed up by the name of which characters, because as I say, it's kind of hard in a way to keep on top of which character is still alive and whose eyes are you viewing through. And what you realise by the end, that actually this is a love story, which came completely out of the blue, which I suppose represents the hope at the end of the war. It's just so cleverly done. 5 stars. And on to Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. As I say, this has made the shortlist of the Women's Prize. And this is a book about the first year of the siege of Sarajevo during the Yugoslavian Civil War. And it's perfectly serviceable, but it's an unspectacular read, I felt. I can't quite see why it's made it onto the Women's Prize, because one of the comments on the back is how authentic it reads, and yes, it absolutely is authentic. She's based it on the life stories of 2 of her relatives. As I say, she's part part Bosnian Serb herself, or her mother was Bosnian Serb. And also she's done a lot of research, and it reads very authentically, but that's not enough for fiction. Fiction has to transport you. Fiction has to move you. And I just felt reading this siege, it's the same as other siege stories I've read, really. It was relaying information about what it felt like, rather than making you feel it. That's the problem. And the main character, who's called Zora, is an artist. And she sends her ailing mother and her husband away to their daughter, who's relocated to England, has married an Englishman, and says, because they're not expecting it to descend into chaos. And by the time she realises that she's better off joining them, getting out there, the airport's closed and she can't get out. That's why she's in a state of siege, even though she's Bosnian Serb herself. And there are sort of compromises where her Bosnian Muslim neighbours are glad that she stayed, that she's putting nationalism in their eyes of independent Bosnia ahead of her ethnicity, which is Serb. But as I say, she's an artist, and she loses all of her work as her studio is hit. And I didn't feel anything. And she's making do. She's sort of keeping a young her neighbour's child entertained by giving her art lessons. They're sort of painting on the backs of the UN food boxes once they've emptied the boxes. It should move me more than it does. But it's about an artist, but it's not very literary, it's not very artistic, there's not great insight into the nature of her art. Very, very occasionally there's some interesting, what I'd call literary writing, because there's a good metaphor. So she's talking about how everything is black brown burned, or just grey. A private back room where the chairs, plants and TV set are coated in pale grey powder, and there's scorched geometric wallpaper on the wall. Unsettled, Zora looks away. The only colour left in the city is the green of the mountains, where weaponry glints among the trees like metal teeth. So that's a great image, but they were few and far between. And as I say, to me, first of all, I think if it had been first person rather than third person, it would be more involving. And I didn't want to be drawn a picture. I wanted the guts of it. I wanted to feel the sense of siege, and I never did. I gave this 3 stars. Now on to I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. Now before I talk about this book, I just wanted to refer to a tag that came out a few years ago called My Neck of the Woods, which was originated by Kelly over at Books I'm Not Reading, and I shall give the link to her channel if you go and support her. And My Neck of the Woods tag was basically talking about famous literary related people, i.e. authors, but not necessarily, who derive from the area in which you live or the area in which you grew up. You had the choice. And when I did it, and again I'll leave the link to mine, there really aren't any, because I live in sort of London suburbia, which is soul death quite honestly for artists. We do produce musicians. I mean, Elton John is from this area. George Michael was from the area where I grew up. And I ought to say that where I live now is pretty near where I grew up. But it just so happens, in the last few years, with the sort of a wave of new British writers of immigrant backgrounds, actually, that's no longer true. So here is a map of the northern end of the London Underground, which is my local underground line. And there are 4 stops within the bunch at the top of this line, which now play host to writers. So Sheena Patel is one of them, and she grew up in Kingsbury, which is where I grew up. But where I grew up was on the borders of Kingsbury and Wembley Park. So that's another author, me at Wembley Park. And then the author of In My Mad and Furious City, Guy Garetny, who's just got a new novel out, which I haven't read either of his books. He grew up in Neasden, and you'll see that's the one after Wembley Park. And then 2 on from Neasden is Willesden Green, where of course Zadie Smith grew up, and her book White Teeth is all about the Willesden Green area. And I did, when I got married, we lived in Kilburn, which is one more stop further down from Willesden Green. But when we had our twins born, we needed more space, so we bought a flat in Willesden Green. And just another link between me and Sheena Patel is this was originally published in hardback by Rough Trade Publishing. And Rough Trade Publishing is the publishing offshoot of a major independent record store called Rough Trade Records, where I worked for 19 years. So anyway, that's sort of not directly relevant to this book. She does mention Kingsbury in here, but that's not really what I want to talk about. So I have to report I'm not a fan of this book, but I may be a fan of her as a writer. So what do I mean by that? Well, most serious fiction is comprised of some sort of balance of character and interrelationships with sociological observation, you know, that these characters move about in a certain age, era, culture, all that sort of thing. And for my taste, most books veer far more on the character side. I mean, why wouldn't you? It's one of the most important staples of writing fiction, and are far less successful in this sort of sociological reportage, either because it's very clumsy and it's not really embedded in the work, it's sort of glommed on, or it's nonsense, such as The Power by Naomi Alden, which has some of the worst geopolitical analysis I've ever seen. Or, as I say, it's just, you know, or it's just not very engaging. The curious thing about this book is the sociological stuff, which is few and far between, is far more interesting and engaging than the personalities of the characters. It's basically a menage a trois, although in some ways it's a menage a dozen. Although we don't get to see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But basically, the guy is a player of women. He's married. He has 2 long-term mistresses, of which they are the other 2 characters. One of those is a sort of Gwyneth Paltrow type, sort of very refined, elegant, privileged, white. And she's a social media influencer. She has a channel on Instagram where she's basically pimping all these, you know, sort of handcrafted stuff and whole food that, you know, which is, she's all ripped off from her father, who was doing this sort of quite radical alternative lifestyle a whole generation before she came on the scene. She's just sort of inherited it and carried it on and commercialised it through social media. And then the other woman is of colour. She's much more sort of lower middle class or middle class, doesn't have any of the privileges of the white woman. And she refers to the guy as the man I want to be with. So she absolutely hates the fact that he has this other woman. She can sort of accept that he has other sort of casual flings, but this other woman really gets under her skin. And she's basically cyber-stalked her, following her every movement, which is, of course, offered up on Instagram and presumably other social media platforms. So she's not really a fan at all. And these 3 people are so hateful, really. You know, the privileged woman is so privileged, but she's so vapid. The woman who is competing with her is not very sister-like in the sense of, you know, supporting women. She hates this woman for obvious reasons. But when she can't understand why the guy still has a thing for this other woman when this other woman has moved on from him, or seemingly moved on, and they do get back, and the privileged woman keeps getting back together with him, or he keeps getting back with her, he can't let her go. That's why she hates the woman, but she also can't understand why she keeps getting into her man's, you know, mind, why he keeps sort of chasing after her. When on one occasion he says that no, we're definitely finished now, suddenly she switches position, the woman of colour, to actually feeling sympathy for her. Well, of course she would, because she sees herself in that position. She doesn't want to imagine a position where the guy finishes with her. So there's a lot of identifying with her, which becomes, you know, indistinguishable from stalking, really. But why, you know, why is she hankering after this guy? He actually puts a sex ban on their relationship. They've only had sex 6 times, and he claims it was too intense. That's why he can't. But he still likes her. She, of course, you know, wants more and is prepared even to go without sex if she can have the relationship with him. I don't get it. I don't believe in any of these characters. I certainly don't want to be in a room with any of these characters. They're just horrendous. And, you know, one conversation, you know, both the women are writers. The privileged woman is given a large advance for a book based on, you know, her Instagram posts. It's just sort of, you know, cutting and pasting those. Whereas one presumes that the woman of colour is some version of Sheena Patel, even if it's sort of a fictionalised, heavily fictionalised one. So a serious literary writer. Because, you know, the sentences here are very good and the images are very good. She can write. That's not in question. And in a way, she's sort of, you know, the man is furious at his privileged mistress, and the woman of colour gets it out of him. That's because he thinks her book is so vapid. So in a way, not only are the two women sort of jousting with each other sexually and in bed and desire and everything, but it's their books are doing battle as well. Who is the more impressive book to the man who has so much power and is so loathsome? I mean, you know, all his flaws and his cowardice and his weakness are on show in here. So all of that, which is most of the book, is very, very unengaging, and why I didn't like this book. But in between, she drops morsels of sociological analysis. In a way, she drops them to keep me, the reader, as sort of hanging on for more, in the same way as the man drops morsels of hope for the woman of colour. Anyway, so, you know, she'll talk about sort of colonialism, race, ethnicity, America and Britain's role in screwing up the world, and how colonisation as an attitude and approach to relationships is what's causing ecological damage, all these sorts of things. And I think she does it really well. She also talks about people of colour trying to get into the publishing industry. She also idly wonders whether this guy likes her because he can represent by having a woman of colour on his arm and all that kind of stuff. But I just want to read you, and these are sort of standout chapters because they're a very different tone to when the personal stuff gets in. So she's talking about the privileged woman's social media activity. She inserts herself into the narrative as if she needs to be there to make sense of it for you. The othered image or object or person needs to be processed through her eyes, her brain, and then her fingers, transformed into captions on Instagram, which then turbocharge its value. In this way, she signals her approval, which then leads to other white people paying attention to it and then admitting it into their personal canons. This is whiteness. It is everywhere, pervasive. Its assumption that it needs to be there to sanitise, to give order by creating a hierarchy. Whiteness on its own is empty. It is forceful in its insistence of its peculiar quality of absence. It refuses to be described in and of itself, and instead it needs some other thing to define itself against. In whiteness's view, everything else is full of itself, so full and busy with living that those things cannot have the panoramic view which only whiteness can offer. Whiteness is nihilistic. It is the distilled form of the death drive, and because it has cold separation to life, it believes it alone is able to categorise, is the one to get rid of the excess, the one to do the accounts, to formulate the systems that regulate the chaos, to decide who lives or dies. It alone could shoulder this responsibility it made up for itself. So anxiously adrift it is without a purpose. So I think when she sort of talks like that, which admittedly is sort of lecturing in a way, but I still find it brilliantly expressed. And she defines herself in opposition to this woman of taste. It's really good about privilege and how privilege confers an automatic assumption that these people have taste of the fine furniture in life, of fine foods and all this sort of stuff. And I think it's really, really good at analysing the difference between having refined taste and people like me who are just not bothered about what clothes we wear, what food we eat, and that sort of thing. But she's defining herself in opposition to this woman, and yet in order to do that, she's stressing her own otherness, i.e. her own ethnicity, the colour of her skin, and also her class background to a lesser extent, because she does wish that she had an understanding of taste and an appreciation of fine art and all these sorts of things. So while she's complaining about being othered in the world, which she is, she also relies and asserts it in distinction to this woman who she hates. So it's an interest, you know, again, that aspect of it I found was an interesting tension. But overall, you know, ploughing through, let's say, 160 pages out of 200 of these dreadful people I couldn't stomach it, really. So I gave it 3 stars because it's well written stylistically and it makes a lot of interesting points that make you stop and think. But God, those characters. And I think it's a deliberate choice. I mean, I think she knows that these are repulsive people, and that's a high-risk strategy. So I applaud her for that. But it's a strategy that did not work for me. And on to Breakfast of Champions, Kurt Vonnegut. I wish I'd read this 20 years ago, even though when it was written in '73, the themes it was going on about, again, colonialism, environmentalism, how we treat animals, consumerism. And crime and things. All of these are still obviously relevant today. But unfortunately, in the meantime, I'd read this, I Hate the Internet by Jared Cobbett, one of my all-time favourite books, which covers a lot of the themes in here. I think much more sharply, with much greater sophistication. Here, Vonnegut, because of his sort of affable style, it's droll. He treats everything, so all these terrible things, the fact that Earth is going to die, and the fact that we are sort of desire machines, unthinking machines, all this sort of stuff, which is very relevant, but it's a bit offhand. It's given an offhand treatment. You could turn to any page here at random, and if this wasn't going to be such a long video, I'd do it, and you'd open it up and read a paragraph, and there'd be something you'd titter about. But ultimately, it was a little unsatisfactory. There are some interesting authorly things. So this was sort of about halfway through his oeuvre, where he'd struggled a long time writing short stories and not really getting anywhere. And then Slaughterhouse-Five blew up, and he became an overnight success kind of thing. And he says in the preface to this book that this book represents him getting rid of everything that he's done up till now, getting rid of the characters who are repeated. So Kilgore Trout is the author character in here, who, like Vonnegut, wrote lots of sort of science fiction stories that went into magazines, but no one's heard of him. Vonnegut certainly had that stage of his career. So this is the big kiss-off, thank you and goodbye to Kilgore Trout. So it's interesting that he's sort of getting rid of a lot of what he calls junk. And the reason I picked this up is because I saw a very, very good documentary on Vonnegut, new documentary, by one of the directors or producers who did Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is a lifetime project. He got to know Vonnegut, and they were great friends. And I think it took 20 years in the making, this documentary, and it finally got released in the last year or so. And I saw it, and it was really, really good. And the 2 books it made me pick up, one was this, and the other, which I haven't read yet, and I haven't got here, but it was, I think, his last book called Time. Oh God, what's it called? I'll put it. I'll put it there. So, if I'd read this 20 years ago, before we all got so sophisticated and knowing and sort of enlightened about a lot of the issues facing the world, particularly things like environmentalism, you know, I think this would have made me very angry. As it was, it's a bit offhand and almost slapstick, really. So I was slightly disappointed by it. 4 stars. And finally, on to a poetry collection, a debut poetry collection by a Northern Irish writer called James Conor Patterson, called Bandit Country. Now, Bandit Country, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, was part of the border between North and South in the county of Armagh, which was basically, literally bandit country, because, you know, the IRA could use it to cross back to the safety of the Irish border where they couldn't be touched. And they carried out a lot of bombings and robberies and hijacks. It's quite a rural area, although this poet's from Newry, which is the major city in that, or one of the major cities in that area. So it was known as Bandit country. So I was under the impression this was going to be a book redolent of that particular type of lawless, you know, in the 20th century, and yet it's almost like sort of the, you know, the frontier in America, sort of cowboy country. But it isn't, it's much wider than that. So the one thing I didn't get actually is a sense of this area around Newry and Bandit country. It is very much about a Northern Ireland Catholic, brought up, you know, I don't know where his sympathies lie, but you know, if you were brought up Catholic in Northern Ireland, your chances are you're going to be immersed in the whole Republican ideology, even if you didn't particularly, you know, sort of want to advance it in any way. But there are poems here that are set in London and Liverpool, and unusually, it's quite a few of the poems, it employs rhyme. And subtle rhyme, because a lot of rhyme is sort of really clunky and obvious, but it only dawned on me about halfway through that there's rhymes in some of these poems, which, you know, respect to that. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. So just to give you an idea, this is called London Poem, in which we bully home in... Oh, sorry, the other thing I would say is there's quite a lot of vernacular, sort of heavily accented Northern Irish. It's English, but it's heavily accented. Indeed, there's a limited glossary in the back. So it is, in a way, the strongest thing about the identity of this collection is in its sort of language. It's very localised language. This is called London Poem, in which we bully home into coherence, in which rooms distend we pizza boxes, HDMI cables, glasses of Pinot Grigio, and libraries of unreturned library books, in which measures of expatriation becomes a handbook for negotiating the tube. Language is my home, alive other than in speech, in which articulation moves through the ingredients culled from our shopping list. Garlic, chocolate, regular white bread, in which nourishment is spread, mouth to mouth, skin to skin, and our salt rebuff to England has less to do with speech and more the small republic sprawled across our mattress. So I like this a lot, 4 stars. And that's it. That's my recent reads. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. I might read Steve Toltz's new novel. He's the Australian writer. There's his previous 2 novels. There's been a laugh on every page. If this is written in the same style, will I have tired of that? I don't know. We'll see. I'll get back to you on that one. So thanks very much. Till next time.